You're listening to Everybody Pulls the Tarp, the go-to podcast for high performers. I'm Andrew Moses. Each week, you'll hear my thought-provoking conversations with Olympians, pro athletes, CEOs, elite coaches, best-selling authors, and other high performers to uncover their secrets to success. Get ready to be inspired each week when we talk about leadership, teamwork, work ethic, and more. Are you ready? Let's go. This week, my guest is former professional basketball player and accomplished writer, Dan Grunfeld. Dan's work has been published in NBC News, Sports Illustrated, and many more. Today, he works in venture capital. He is the son of former New York Knicks star and NBA executive Ernie Grunfeld, the only player in NBA history whose parents survived the Holocaust. Dan has chronicled his family's remarkable story of tragedy, survival, and triumph in his book, By the Grace of the Game, The Holocaust, A Basketball Legacy, and an Unprecedented American Dream. As you'll hear in our conversation, Dan's family experienced tremendous loss in the Holocaust. His grandmother lost 5 siblings and both of her parents, and Dan's grandfather lost his sisters and both parents as well. But even in the darkest of times, there were heroes and reasons to believe. Dan's grandmother was saved by a Swedish diplomat named Raoul Wallenberg, who saved the lives of tens of thousands of Jews. And Dan's grandmother even risked her own life to save 17 other people. Unfortunately, there are far too many families like Dan's affected by the atrocities of the Holocaust. This conversation with Dan is a deeply personal one for me because my grandparents are also Holocaust survivors. My grandmother left Germany with her family as a young child after Hitler's rise to power and made it safely to the United States. At age 15, my grandfather was separated from his family by Nazis in Germany and never saw his parents or sister again. All 3 were killed in concentration camps. My grandfather escaped to a farm in England and eventually made it safely to the United States as well. He and my grandmother met in New York and built a new life together. Throughout my life, my grandparents have always been one of my greatest sources of inspiration. Their experiences have taught me about the importance of family, hard work, making the most of opportunities, the importance of treating people the right way, and the power of seeing the good in every situation. In the conversation you are about to hear, I asked Dan all about his family's history, what he's learned from it, and the impact it has on him. Like me with my family, so much of Dan's life is shaped deeply by his own family's history. And we both feel a sense of great responsibility to share these powerful stories and lessons for generations to come. So, let's pull the tarp and get straight to Dan Grunfeld.
All right, Dan, where I want to begin. So your family story is tremendous, and I've read your book, and you and I have had a chance to talk before. I am also the grandson of Holocaust survivors, as you know. My grandparents escaped Nazi Germany. My grandmother and my grandfather both had very unique experiences in terms of how they got to America, and it's something that's impacted me deeply in my life. I'm curious from your vantage point, can you remember the first time that you recall really hearing and understanding some of the experiences that your grandparents and extended family endured during that time?
I don't remember the first time, but I don't remember a time when I wasn't aware of it, right? So from the time I was very little, I just had an awareness that my grandparents had been through very difficult things. And of course, they shared it with me in an age-appropriate way. And you know this, being the grandson of Holocaust survivors, often it's a binary. Either they don't want to talk about it because things are too traumatic, or they feel an obligation to. And my grandmother was in the latter group. You know, my grandfather unfortunately passed away when I was a baby, but I've always been so close with my grandmother. She turns 98 in June. She lives in the Bay Area. As you know, she is the star of our family. She's the star of the book. And she just always was very honest with me. So I can't recall the first time, but I don't remember not having an awareness of kind of that my grandparents went through some really hard things.
Dan, was there a story or two that you can remember that stood out maybe more than others, something that's impacted you more deeply than other stories?
Yes, I mean, of course, there are so many stories with this whole journey. I mean, my grandmother having lost five siblings and both parents in the Holocaust. My grandfather lost his whole family, so both sisters, both parents. I think one of the stories that has always and will always stay with me is the one related to Raoul Wallenberg, who's regarded as one of the greatest heroes of the Holocaust, credited for saving roughly 100,000 Jews in Budapest. And my grandmother was one of them. And he saved her life twice, right? And so the first time was he issued protective passports called Schutz passes, which gave Jews in Budapest a level of security for some time. So my grandmother got one for herself, but she risked her life to obtain 17 passes for other people. So she's not only my hero, she's also a hero. It's true. She risked her life for others. And when she was eventually captured by the Nazis, when that passport was no longer recognized, she was placed in the Budapest ghetto. She was reunited there with an older brother of hers. And at the end of the war, they saw 20 Nazis enter the ghetto with machine guns over their shoulders. And word quickly spread that they were there to kill the remaining 80,000 Jews in the ghetto. And so they raced up the stairs of the building that they were sleeping in, and they found a small attic space, and there was room for about 4 or 5 people. There were more than a dozen packed in there. And they waited for 10 minutes and 20 minutes and then an hour. And they didn't hear shots, or they didn't hear screams. They really didn't hear anything. And eventually they went to check, and the Nazis had retreated. And soon the ghetto was liberated, and my grandmother was free to go. That's how she survived the Holocaust. And she never really knew why she was freed at that time. And 40 years later, right? So that was 1945. In 1985, when my grandmother was in the United States, living in the Bay Area, my dad's an NBA basketball player. A movie was made about Raoul Wallenberg's life. And it was in that movie that my grandmother saw one of the final scenes of Wallenberg learning about the order to massacre the remaining Jews in the ghetto. And he got in his car, raced to the ghetto, confronted the general, convinced him to call off the massacre. So it took my grandmother 40 years to learn that Wallenberg saved her life, not just once, but twice during the war. And he's such a symbol of goodness and of true heroism. And so that's a story that's always stuck with me. And he's a person that I've just always held very close because of what he's done. We wouldn't be here today without him.
Dan, I'm curious. I mean, as I think about that story, and anybody listening tries to process all of it, there's so much there to unpack. When you think about understanding these stories, and you think about your experience as a child hearing these stories and learning about this history, do you think that there were things that you did differently, or that you thought about differently because of these stories and because of these experiences that your family went through that you learned about?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I carry that history with me, and from the book, it's a big part of what shaped me. And so I think first, treating people the right way, right? We know what's at stake when people aren't treated fairly. And I was always raised not only to be kind and to be fair to people, but really stand up when you see things that aren't right. Because I mean, and my grandma always says that it started with words, and we needed voices, and there weren't enough voices, and one thing led to another. And then the Holocaust was the eventual outcome of that. So for me, how you treat people, how you stand up for what's right, and then also taking advantage of the opportunities you have, right? Be very intentional about what you do, because not everyone has had those opportunities. Certainly, I mean, the situation that I was born into with great privilege, my dad being an NBA basketball player, I had so many resources and opportunities, but just being here, right? And having the chance to live out my dreams and go for what I want. My ancestors didn't have that, right? So you take things a little more seriously, those values of hard work, determination, perseverance. I saw that from my grandparents, from my dad, and those are things that have just shaped me so much to this day.
I feel, a lot of the same things, Dan. And when I think back to my childhood and learning about some of what my grandparents experienced, my grandfather in particular, who passed away in 2000 when I was a lot younger, he was separated at the age of 15 on a train by the Nazis when he was out for the day with his father. He never saw his mother, father, or sister again. They were all killed in concentration camps, and by some good fortune and twists and turns and some help along the way, he got to a farm in England and eventually to the United States, and he survived, but left his entire, lost his entire family behind. One of the things, of the many lessons that I've taken away from my grandfather, is that concept of not leaving opportunities on the table, taking advantage of the opportunities that you have. And a big thing for him, I always remember, was education. He came to this country with really no understanding of the He left Germany. He had to learn a new language. He didn't complete a high school education. Education was always something that was very valuable to him. And it always it was something that I thought about. I remember, having conversations with my parents and thinking to myself, if there was a math test I didn't want to study for, or a science lab I didn't want to do, or an assignment I didn't want to write, I would actually, as a 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old, say to myself, my grandfather didn't have this opportunity. I get to do this, instead of something that I have to do. And it's something that I still think about today. You talked about, you used the word privilege and having, growing up in a situation with a father who's an NBA basketball player. I'm curious, if we fast forward to that a little bit, what do you remember about your childhood growing up around the New York Knicks? That's got to be another set of circumstances and experience where you can accelerate your learning, and it maybe shapes you in unique ways that others might not have access to. So let's talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, absolutely. So, growing up, my dad was the general manager of the Knicks. And actually, my birth was planned around the NBA basketball schedule because my dad was a player for the Knicks and he had 2 long road trips. And so I was delivered by C-section. And so my parents planned my arrival. So my dad went on 1 road trip. He could be there for my birth. He went on another road trip and he was there for my bris, right? The Jewish ritual of circumcision on the 8th day. So quite literally, I was born around the Knicks basketball schedule. So different. My upbringing, of course, was so different than my ancestors. And so there were so many perks associated with that lifestyle, right? I got to meet the players and I would go to practices and I just got to really love something with my dad. And my whole family, we got to share these great experiences. It was amazing. I mean, I learned so much about the game. I learned what it takes. Not only did my dad played, so he taught me, but I got to see it firsthand. And when my dad was an immigrant in the United States of America, and as you know from the book, he tragically lost his brother. So there's really a lot of hardships in my dad's life. And he used to take the subway from Queens, New York. My grandfather would take the subway from the Bronx, from the fabric store. They'd meet at Madison Square Garden. They would buy the cheapest tickets because those are the ones they could afford. They'd sit in the last row and watch the Knicks. And, my dad fell in love with Dave DeBusschere, who was this hard-nosed hustler for the Knicks. And that's where, my dad learned the language, healed from the loss of his brother. By the way, DeBusschere's number 22 hangs in the rafters of Madison Square Garden. My dad's number 22 hangs in the rafters in Knoxville, Tennessee, where he went to college, and he wore 22 because of DeBusschere. But that's how my dad used to watch the Knicks, right? And I watched the Knicks in a private skybox because my dad was the general manager of the team. So much can change over a generation. And yeah, it was just such a great experience. There was pressure associated with it. I'm very honest about it in the book, right? Having a dad who's great at what you want to be great at. Like, he was known as such a good player and this really well-known executive. I felt the eyeballs. I internalized that. It drove me, but it also held me back at times. And, and people are cruel, so whenever the Knicks lost, I would hear about it. And, it makes you very close as a family. So there are things you have to navigate, but all in all, I wouldn't change anything about it. It was such a cool way to grow up.
I want to dig into that a little bit, Dan. I mean, everybody's parents go to work. Not many people's parents go to work and then have their job documented kind of on a daily basis in the New York papers and on sports news shows. And there's a part of the book where you talk about the time when ultimately your father was fired by the Knicks as a Knicks executive and what that experience was like. I'm curious, how did you process that? What were some of the things maybe he said to you about that experience, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, so I was a freshman in high school, and my dad had made some trades that were controversial at the time. He had acquired Latrell Sprewell and Marcus Camby, and he had traded John Starks and Charles Oakley. These are really famous and well-known Knicks players. He took some risks, and it took a while for the team to come together. It was a shortened season because of the lockout. And like you said, when you're the general manager of the New York Knicks, there's so much attention. So my dad would be on the cover of the sports section, if they lost 4 in a row with a clown nose. But if they won 4 in a row, he had a crown on, right? So it kind of teaches you from an early age, you're never as good as they say you are. You're never as bad as they say you are. And my dad really epitomizes that. He's not a talker. He doesn't go to the media. He just puts his head down and works, and he had amazing success from that. And I learned that from him. But it's hard when you're young and you have great pride, in your family and your dad. It was tough to kind of read that criticism and things of that nature. So my dad was let go right before the playoffs, and the Knicks were the number. They made the playoffs as number 8 seed, and they beat the Miami Heat, who were the 1 seed, and they ended up going to the NBA Finals, right? On the backs of Latrell Sprewell and Marcus Camby, who my dad had traded for, right? So many conflicting emotions because all his decisions, all his moves were proven right. They had this amazing success, but he was let go. And don't forget, like, this history that we just talked about. My dad's an immigrant, right? He fled communism under duress, came to the United States at 9 years old, spoke fluent Hungarian, Romanian, and Italian, didn't speak a word of English, had never touched a basketball, lost his brother, who was his hero, and basketball was salvation for him. And then here he is, not only did he become a player for the New York Knicks, but then he's a general manager of the team. So it meant more to us and to him than anyone could have ever imagined, right? So to be fired in that way from that situation was heartbreaking. And for me, as a freshman in high school, basketball player, just lived and breathed the Knicks, it was so tough. But it relates to the story we've already talked about, right? My family's been through far worse, right? My dad's parents were Holocaust survivors, and it hurt everyone, but he just said, we move on, we get to work. And that was the mentality. And so he was hired as the general manager of the Milwaukee Bucks not long thereafter, built great teams there, built great teams for the Washington Wizards. And so he really just tried to stay positive, mourned a little bit because it was so hard, but you keep moving forward. I'll tell you, for me as a kid at that age, it made me very angry, right? Because I saw my dad not being treated fairly. And, I was motivated to be a basketball player, to play basketball at Stanford. So when that happened, it just kind of, that fire in my belly got a little hotter, got a little bigger, and we just moved forward with it.
I think one of the things that people forget, especially in today's day with social media and Twitter, anybody will take to Twitter and be an expert on how to construct a roster, how to coach a team, how to play a game, fire this guy, fire that woman, fire this person. But these are people. And I think generally society forgets that. I'm curious, do you remember what your dad said to you? I mean, that day when he lost that job at the Knicks, that obviously meant so much to you and him and your family.
It was my mom who told me, and I write about it in the book, right? My guidance counselor came into my last period class, which was biology, and said, "Hey, could you stop by the office after?" And there had been a lot of rumors in the papers. And so I kind of had an idea of what was going on. And it was my mom who just kind of told me. And, I cried. It was, all I knew was the Knicks. My birth was scheduled around the Knicks, and then I was 15 years old at the time. So that's how I kind of got the news. But I just remember my dad trying to comfort me, even though it was, he had lost that job, but we're going to be okay. Things happen. And listen, this is the life of an athlete working in sports. You have to be able to deal with adversity. Things aren't always going to go your way. And again, from where my dad comes from, to have been through what he went through, and then he stood on top of the Olympic podium as a gold medalist for the United States a dozen years after coming to America, not speaking English, being made fun of by kids on the streets of New York. Like, he's been through a lot. He stays even keeled. And so he tried to just let me know, like, you're going to be fine. I'm going to be fine. We're going to be fine. And he couldn't have been more right, And so these are the experiences you go through. You learn from it, and you just keep moving forward.
That's one of the things I talk about. I'm so fortunate that my grandma is still with me, and we get to talk about these stories and these experiences, that she and my grandfather had. And I always tell people she has this amazing way of kind of recentering me and giving me perspective and kind of being a voice of reason, because no matter what I'm experiencing or what I'm sharing with her, she's been through a lot, and she's been through challenges, and she always tells me, things are going to work out one way or another. Look at our family history, and we're all here still talking about it. Dan, I'm curious. You talked about overcoming adversity. You also alluded to your career in basketball on the court, and you had a fantastic career at Stanford, which was kind of just taking off when you had this devastating injury. I want to get into that a little bit. So you get to Stanford, you start adjusting, and you're starting to build momentum on the court, and then you have this injury. How did you process all that? Was it kind of the same, going back to kind of the same well that you've been filling with these lessons over the course of your life and experiences?
Absolutely. I did go to that same well. And listen, like, basketball is wins and losses. What my family went through prior is life and death, yours as well, right? So you kind of just have that perspective. But I was just full steam ahead with basketball, wanted to play in the NBA and wanted to play at Stanford since I was in 6th grade because my grandmother lives 25 minutes from campus. And I got there and I was, I struggled at first and, it was an adjustment period. But by my junior year, I was the second leading scorer in the conference. I was projected as a late first round, early second round pick of the NBA draft. So my dreams were really coming true. And as you mentioned, tore my ACL towards the end of the season on national television, home game against our biggest rivals, Tiger Woods sitting courtside, the whole thing. Not only was Tiger Woods sitting courtside, but my grandmother was sitting 20 feet away, from where I got hurt because she came to every single game. And that's true. Every single home game I played at Stanford, she was there. And if she were on the call right now, she would interrupt and say, and some road games too, which is true. She would come to Cal and USC and UCLA. She was there for everything. And so I talked about this in the book, tore my ACL, knew immediately that something really bad had happened, it was like the typical traumatic injury for an athlete at the horrible time, the whole thing. I was panicking on the floor, rolling around. And by the time I came to my senses, I realized my grandmother was kneeling down next to me, rubbing my head. The ushers, like in the arena, they knew her, so they didn't dare stop her. She just, she just came down. She said, I need to be there. But that kind of shows you, man, like she was right next to me and we had dinner that night. And I remember thinking, like, if this is the worst thing that happens to me in my life, I'm going to be just fine. And so, yeah, you mourn it. And my grandma, if she were on the call now, she'd say, I don't want to talk about this. She still to this day doesn't want to talk about that injury because she knows how much it all meant to me and how hard that was for me. But so she gave me the space to kind of mourn it. But also she gave me the motivation, the example to know, like, you just stay positive. You keep working. You don't give up. You keep going. And she had obviously exemplified that during the Holocaust with her amazing story, losing her oldest son, when they had just come to America, all the things she'd been through. I'd seen it. So, yeah, it was a bad thing that happened. It was a bad break, but just got to keep moving.
Dan, you talked earlier about just the added pressure and spotlight and expectations that you put upon yourself, being the son of a former NBA player, an NBA executive, and kind of sharing that dream with your father of becoming an NBA player. How did you reconcile all that? How did you deal with it? I mean, you obviously mentioned it as something that was a challenge. I'm curious, did you come to terms with it eventually? How did you keep going forward with that?
Yeah, it was very much my dream. And my dad never put pressure on me to play basketball, or my mom, right? And I think they were very sensitive to the fact that, like, hey, like, dad is known as a basketball player, is really great at this. And so, and I had some ability and there was a little bit of spotlight on me, but my dad never pressured me. So it wasn't his dream for me to play in the NBA. It was mine and he just supported me. Both my parents did. And I'm really, really grateful and lucky because of that. You know what the funny thing is, right? Like, all I knew was the NBA. Again, because I was born into it and all these things, but my dream was actually fulfilled at the end of the day because I became a professional basketball player. I played high-level basketball at Stanford. I was a pro. Like, my journey was full. And I didn't know it when I was younger because I couldn't have articulated it, but that's what I wanted. I just wanted to go for it. I wanted to become whatever I was going to become. I wanted to become it. And those things happened. It just happened in a different place, right? So instead of putting on a New York Knicks jersey like my dad did, actually, I did put on a New York Knicks jersey because I went to training camp with the Knicks. But instead of, wearing an NBA jersey for 10 years like my dad did, I played for Hapoel Jerusalem in Israel. I played for a top team in Germany. I played in Spain, right? I had a really good run. So I fulfilled my dream. It just looked different than I thought it would.
That's an important lesson in and of itself, right? Is that when we set a goal, when we have a dream, it's not just always point A to point B. There's a lot of different ways to achieve, a specific goal, and you kind of just have to roll with the punches. I would think there's a lot of that you've experienced.
100%. And I'd say it's never point A to point B. Even like you look at LeBron James and all the most famous, well-known, incredible athletes. If you double click on their stories, there's always adversity. There are always bumps in the road. So that line from A to B is a zigzag and diagonals, but it's really what's inside of you. Do you keep going? Do you not give up? Do you persevere until you get where you want to be?
Was there like one thing that you would say to yourself or you would do to kind of like reset? Like, did you have a process or do you have a process today when something lands in front of you that's not expected or that seems, like you're encountering some adversity? Is there something that you do? Do you have a system? Do you have something you say to yourself?
Yeah. There are two mantras that I always kind of go back to. The first one I learned from my trainer in college, Frank, who I write about in the book, who's gained a lot of notoriety since we trained together. Amazing. And what he said to me, which I take to this day, is nothing good comes out of being negative. Nothing bad comes out of being positive. So always just try to reframe. It's not to say that you should be realistic about the things that are happening and you shouldn't just like color over bad things, but the positivity, right? Just to stay positive, to stay hopeful. And he always told me that in college when things were happening, stay positive, stay hopeful. And so I always just kind of anchor back to that. And probably the most important thing is from my dad. And it was from his dad. So it's really passed down through generations. And it's just about hard work. My grandfather always used to say to my dad, if you work hard, good things will happen, period. Right. And I think for someone like myself, who very analytical, I would get in my own head. I would overcomplicate things. That's very simple. Just work, right? Figure out what's the work you can put in? What you can control? My dad would always say that you can only control your own actions. Right. So because so much of it is just good. The wind's going to blow how it blows. You're going to tear your ACL like I did. Things are just going to happen or not happen. And you can't control that. But what you can control is the work you put in. So when I kind of face adversity, when things aren't going well, I anchor back to positivity and work.
One of the things that there's so many great lessons that you shared there and so many great ideas. And I'm just a huge believer that, really the only two things that we can control are attitude and effort. And
there you go.
A lot of what you said there really resonates with me. And I feel this great responsibility. I mean, obviously, I'm sure all or most parents do, to pass lessons and wisdom on to our children and to future generations. I've kind of come to this realization more recently that, in particular, folks like you and I who have grandparents who survived the Holocaust, as they unfortunately pass on and that generation leaves us eventually and in the not too distant future, we have this incredible responsibility, in my opinion, to move these stories forward and pass them on to other generations. I know you have young kids and they're quite young, just like mine. And, maybe not, ready for some of these stories, but have you started to think about that? Like what you'll say, what you'll share, what you'll do when the time is right?
Absolutely. And I've definitely thought about that whole notion. It's so core of how do you carry these stories forward? How do you pass them on? I'm lucky because I have a book that I wrote, so I can hand my book to my sons probably around bar mitzvah age, so they're almost 4 and almost 1. So it's not quite time yet, but yeah, listen, I mean, like you said, and my book kind of ends this way, these are their stories too. Right. I mean, they were passed down to my dad, then to me, then to my kids, then to their kids. This is where we come from. This is who we are. These are the values that inform why we do what we do, or at least what I hope to impart upon them. And so, yeah, I think about it often. And in our instances where the Holocaust is involved, again, you want to be appropriate. You want to share those details at the right times. But we will do that. We will, when the time is right, we will tell them about what their great-grandparents went through. They will eventually read the book, and it's our job now to carry it forward. And my grandma always says that, because people need to know this is what humans are capable of. This is what can happen. The only way we can kind of be a force for good is to communicate the history, know the history, so it doesn't happen again. And not just to Jewish people, to any people.
And I think that is such an important message for us to wrap up our conversation. I think we all have a responsibility to do good and to lead by example and to spread these messages to everyone, regardless of background, religion, race, ethnicity, age, when of course appropriate. these stories are so important, and these lessons are so important. And I think, obviously there are so many people who have, impacted your life by leading by example and doing the right thing when the right thing in many instances was incredibly hard and incredibly difficult. And, this has been really a great pleasure, Dan, just to dig into your story and your family story a little bit more. And I know I've learned a lot, and I appreciate you spending a few minutes with me this week and sharing your story. And I look forward to catching up again soon. Thank you for joining Everybody Pulls the Tarp, Dan.
It was great. Thanks so much for having me. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining me this week. Be sure to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you can catch all of our upcoming episodes. And if you are like me and want a world full of tarp pullers, then leave a review to help others find us. You can also follow me on Twitter at Andrew H. Moses. That's Andrew H. Moses. And be sure to sign up for my email newsletter at everybodypullsthetarp.com/newsletter. I'll share tips and insights to help you achieve maximum success and happiness. Today is a great day to pull the tarp. I am rooting for you. See you next time.